Okay, so one of the things from here on in, think of the information as like in layers, because you will learn a little bit, and next week we'll learn a little bit more and it'll start to fit together a little bit better. And then the week after that, it'll be learning a little bit more. And then when we start talking about being in the hive and what we're looking at and why we're looking at it and what's happening in the seasons, it'll start to all come together. So one of the things about beekeeping is you got to get comfortable with not knowing, and that's really hard. So that's just, I'll just let you know. So that's kind of how it is. So you might have lots of questions, and I may be saying, yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. That's kind of the way it goes. It's chicken and egg stuff. You've really got to kind of learn a lot before you can start putting the pieces together. So the first thing we're going to talk about is races of bees, because, picking the queens, you're going to hear a lot about it. So the Western honeybee is the Apis mellifera. And the most common races in the US are the Italian, which is the Apis mellifera linguistica, the German or English, which is the Mellifera mellifera, which was originally probably the one that came over in 1622. It was probably the first one here, and it's a dark bee. And then the Carniolan, the Apis mellifera carnica, and the Caucasian, the Apis mellifera caucasica. And they're all, so those are the races of bees, okay? And they all have, you know, kind of different behavior. So some of the different kinds of behavior, they dance differently. They have different foraging. They have, they overwinter differently. Like the Caucasians tend to be able to do better in the colder weather. They they do different propolis collections. So Italians a lot of times will do a lot of propolis. Swarming behavior is different, and the temperament is different. Some bees are just easier to get along with than others. They're just a little nicer. So those are the main kinds of races of bees. But then we also have these different hybrids or lines within the races. So there's the Buckfast, which was a cross. It was a breed that was done by Brother Adam from Buckfast Abbey in the UK, and he died in like 1995, so relatively recent. And the Anatolian are from like Turkey, and Italian and Carniolan, so they're kind of a mix. The Russian is a line of the Caucasian bees, and the Russian are, dark bees. The Cordovan are a line of the Italian bees, and they're really popular because they're kind of a lemon yellow. They're a nice yellow, light yellow color. Janice can tell you that people will call her up and they'd say, I want one of those really pretty yellow bees. And those are the Cordovans. They used to do those. There's the VSH, which is Varroa sensitive hygiene, or SMR, which is suppression of mite reproduction. So these are lines of bees that were bred specifically because of their hygienic behavior and their ability to tell that there was something going on in the cell with the varroa mites. So we're starting to see breeds of bees that are being bred specifically to deal with the varroa mites, okay? And they're mostly Italian. There's also the Minnesota hygienic, which is another one of the hygienic traits where they kind of clean up, and they can sense that the pupa is, or the larva is not healthy. Usually the pupa, because that's when the mites become active. So there's something going on there, and they can tell, and so they'll uncap it and pull it out of the hive. They also are very good about cleaning up after themselves. And this one was bred by Dr. Marla Spivak and Gary Reuter. And Gary actually is an interesting character because he was just sort of and I think he's still alive, a hobby beekeeper who just did all this amazing research. And so you don't have to have a doctorate in apiary science to really be able to contribute to what's going on with the bees. There's a new one that's really kind of popular right now. That's the Saskatraz, which is a combination of German and Russian bees. They were originally bred in Saskatchewan, and they're being sold now in the US, and they're supposed to be good for varroa control. And then there's also the Africanized honeybee, which we also know about, which was a cross between the African honeybees, which is the Apis mellifera sculatata, well, anyway, and the Italian bee. And we don't really have those in North Carolina. They're still in the southern states. But if you're buying bees from, southern Georgia, Florida, or Texas, you may get some bees that are a little on the grumpy side, that they have some Africanized traits to them. And we've seen something that we think is related to that in some of our queens, because one of the things that Africanized honeybees do is they're in warmer climates where there's good food sources all the time. And so rather than store a lot of honey, they just leave, they just abscond, they just take off and find food and a new home somewhere else. And we've seen a little bit of that. So if you're feeding your bees or there's a nectar flow and then you stop and the bees abscond, it could be because there's some Africanized traits. Africanized bees in North Carolina don't do well in the winter, and because of the higher altitudes, they tend to be a little bit easier to deal with. So, but to our knowledge, and the Department of Agriculture apiary inspectors are tracking for Africanized bees coming into North Carolina. As far as we know, they haven't really gotten this far. So those are all kinds of things. On my website, there is a post about a webinar that was done at NC State University. They do monthly webinars, and this one was done last June. And the speaker was Debbie Delaney, who is with the University of Delaware. And she was talking about, hybrids and races and different things like that. And really, it's really, you can't count on the bees having the traits just because of the name. So they're not like at NC State in their apiary, they've got some Saskatraz, and they're just as good about dealing with things as any of the hygienics or whatever. And so her recommendation is, ask the breeder how they're doing selection and talk to them. So anyway, here's some pictures of what some of these different bees look like. So the Italian and the Cordovan tend to be more of the yellow bee. A Buckfast has got a little bit more yellow to it. We have some kind of mixes of Buckfast Italian and Buckfast Carniolans, and they could be a little darker. The Russians are dark, the Saskatraz are dark, and the Caucasians are dark. And the Carniolans are dark as well. So that's kind of what some of the bees, the queen bees, look like, the different colors. But wait, there's more. So one of the things that's been happening recently in, trying to breed bees for mites is Dr. Greg Hunt at the Purdue University has been working with the Heartland Honeybee Breeders Co-op and the Indiana Bee Breeders, and they're identifying bees that are found in nature that tend to be chewing bees. And they call them leg biters or mite maulers, and they have all these different names for them. And they're usually, when a bee gets a mite on it, it's like they don't even really react to it. But these bees, as soon as a mite gets on it, they start, moving and trying to get it off, and their fellows come and help get the mite off of it. And then they like chew a leg off and throw it out so that it can't get back in the hive, or the mite maulers are actually taking a bite out of the bees. So these are bees that are being bred specifically because of their aggressive behavior. And I've had some of the Purdue bee genetics, and I really liked them a lot. And they were really easy to work. But if I would do something that would make them angry, all of a sudden you'd have 5 stings in your hand in a split second. They also bite before they sting, which was really, really interesting. So how do you know for sure if you have a chewing bee? Well, with the ones I had, you can see the size of the entrance reducer on the left. And they actually decided they needed it bigger, so they chewed it out on the right. You can see that they did that. So that's one way to know you have a chewing bee. Another thing we did was I collected mites on a sticky board and we put them under a microscope and you could actually see legs missing and bites out of them. So that was really interesting. And these are bees that they're finding that are existing out there. And so, you know, if you have a microscope, you might check it out and see if you notice any parts to your mites missing, because you may actually have a chewing bee. And if you do, definitely, you know, contact the, there's people at the Heartland honeybee breeders who are collecting information. So there's ways that you can make contact with them and let them know that you actually have some of those bees. It's really pretty interesting. And I like that. I've bought queens from the Heartland honeybee breeders. You know, they're in, you know, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Kentucky. So there's lots of good breeders around that you can buy bees from. If you want to try to figure out which of the breeds you should go with, there are certainly characteristics. You want to go ahead and upload those? Yeah. There are certainly characteristics that, you know, can get you headed in the right direction. But again, you really want to know something about the bee breeder and how they're breeding and how they feel like their bees are doing. Janice and Larry always had really nice bees, except for the survivor bees. They were a little more on the challenging side. So this list of characteristics of types of bees came from UNC's NC State's apiary culture program. And John is right now uploading. If you go to chat, there's some PDFs that he's putting over there. They're just nicer versions of some of these things that, you know, you're welcome, you know, to take advantage of. So, and there's a lot of information in the one that has to do with the characteristics of types of bees. There's also some information about the different types of bees and whatever. So those you might find interesting too. So those are, you know, I don't know how much of it's in the book I recommended, but it's, you know, these are things that I think are kind of helpful to have. And like I said, reasons to consider Italian. They're the most common in this area. They're the easiest to work with for a new beekeeper because they read all the books that we read. Their laying behavior is pretty consistent. You know, you don't really, you won't be surprised by their behavior so much. The hygienic and VSH are more likely to be from the Italian, so they're easier to find. Most of the packages and nukes coming these days have a hygienic queen. But also remember that just because the queen is Italian doesn't mean that the worker bees will be pure Italian, because most of the queens are bred in a way where, you know, it's just open breeding, open mating. And so she goes off and she flies and she mates with, you know, 12 to however many drones, and they could be different. You know, the drones could have different characteristics. You know, they could be carniolan, they could be Russian, they could be other things. And so you may end up with bees, some bees that look like the queen and some bees that are darker and whatever. So that's just, if you buy a queen that was artificially inseminated, they're very expensive, but then the bees that you get, you'll know what their genetics are. So that's, okay. If there's any questions, the next thing we're going to talk about is the different types of bees, and we're going to talk about the life cycle of bees. Any questions? If you have questions anywhere along the way, just put them in the chat. Okay. Okay, so there are three, these are called caste. And so there's the drones, which are the males, there's the queen, and then there's the worker bee. And so the way that they're differentiated is a queen lays an egg, And if she fertilizes the egg, it could either be a worker bee or a queen bee, and the worker bees decide if it's going to be a new queen. If she doesn't fertilize the egg, it'll become a drone, and the drones are the bigger guys. So that's kind of the basics. And the worker bees, if it's going to be a worker bee that's fertilized, they'll do light feeding, and they'll do feeding with worker honey as opposed to or worker jelly, as opposed to if it's going to be a queen, they'll do super heavy feeding with royal jelly that's a lot richer. And they'll, like I said, they decide that if it's going to be a queen or not. And we'll talk a little bit later about why they would do that. This is really, really important. We call this honeybee math. And so it's really important that you know this. You're going to use this so many places. Every time you go in your hive, you'll be thinking about these kinds of things because they're really, really important. So the queen lays an egg, and in 3 days, typically, the egg will hatch. And that's true if it's a worker, if it's a drone, or if it's a queen. And then once it hatches, it becomes a larva. And if it's a worker, it'll be a larva between days 3 to 9, so for 6 days. So here we have a worker 3 days, egg 6 days, larva, and then 12 days pupa. So that's a total of 21 days from the time the egg is laid until the bee emerges. For the drones, it's a little bit longer because they're bigger. So it's up to 3 days as an egg, up to 7 days as a larva, and then 14 days as a pupa. So up to 24 days. And this is really important because when we start talking about dealing with varroa mites, these extra 3 days are really make a huge difference in the mite load that you have in your hive. And then a queen is, even though she's the biggest of them all, 3 days an egg, about 5.5 days as a larva, and about 7.5 days as a pupa. And so they say about 16 days. It could be 15 to 17. I usually count on about 15. And if I'm tracking queen cells, and we'll talk about why I would even do that. But this is bee math, so you really need to know about this. And we're going to talk about each of these stages and what they look like so that you're able to identify them in the hive. So if I go in and I'm inspecting my hive and I can't find my queen, but I'm seeing eggs, or if I'm seeing really young larvae, I know that the queen was in there in the last few days, in the last at least 4 or 5 days. And so that's really important. And part of the reason that's important is because, you know, the last time I was in there, I could have killed the queen or lost the queen or done something. So you want to be able to make sure that you always have a queen in there. So we're going to talk a little bit about life cycle. This is a queen actually laying in a cell. So you can see she's got her abdomen down going into the cell there. And that's why she's so much longer, so she can get her tail down in there. So this is what eggs look like. They're little bitty. You know, I talk about when you're putting together what you need to be working the bees, that having reading glasses, magnifying glasses is important. If you've got really young eyes and you can see down in the frame and be able to see it, that works really well. I have to have magnifying glasses at least 2.5 to 3 times for me to be able to see. And especially as the wax ages and it gets darker, if it's new wax, it's pretty easy to pick out the eggs. But if it's older wax, I really need to have some kind of glasses to be able to see in there. And the thing with the eggs is when the queen is laying the egg, the day that she lays it, the egg is straight up. And then the next day it's at about 2 o'clock, and then it'll eventually fall over as it hatches. So you can kind of tell, you know, these eggs were in the last day or something. So that's one of the things that's useful to know about eggs, but that's what they look like, and that's why you might need glasses. The larva is 3 to 10 days, depending on, you know, is it a worker bee or is it a drone? And you can see that they basically look like grubs in there, and they're growing to the size of the cell. So this is one, so you can see eggs down in the right corner. And this is not atypical. When you're looking at a frame of brood, you'll see eggs on, you know, sort of toward the edge. And as you get closer to the middle, typically the queen will start in the middle and lay and then kind of circle out and keep laying and keep laying. And so you'll have eggs on the outside, and then you'll have smaller and smaller size larvae as you get inside. And you can also see that white milky stuff that they're sitting in. That's what the worker bees are feeding them, so that the larvae will have food that they're being fed the whole time. So once a worker bee hatches, or a drone hatches, the part of the job of the worker bees is to feed them about every 15 minutes. And they do put out like scents to let the worker bees know that they're hungry and they need food. So that's one of the things we'll talk about next time when we talk about pheromones. So that's kind of what it looks like with the larva, and the larva will grow to fit the size of the cell. And so if you've got a little bigger cell, it's going to take it a little bit longer. So if you got a really little bee, they may not take 6 days. It may be 5.5 days before they go to the pupal stage. But with what we've got going right now, it's 6 days. So, and so here's an example. It shows the egg, and then it shows, and they call these instars. So when you hear the folks presenting on beekeeping, you know, like at NC State or something, they refer to instars all the time. And this is just the different stages of the larva. So, you know, either, you know, as they're growing and they're growing and they're growing. So that's kind of how it looks. You can see how it just really kind of takes up the whole space. And then it'll sort of turn, and then the worker bees will cap it. And they cap it with a combination of wax and, you know, some kind of a fibery, mostly wax, but a little bit of a fiber that, so that it's porous, so that, you know, air can get in there. And then it's like they're in a cocoon, right? So you know how caterpillars will spin a cocoon, and then they kind of go through this metamorphosis and become butterflies. Well, this is kind of what's happening with the honeybee, where they're starting to change and take on all the characteristics of an actual bee. And one of the things that's interesting that I noticed in the book is she keeps saying, well, we don't really know why they do these various things. And I think it has to do with, when she says that, I think it means that they haven't done enough research, scientific research, to know, you know, for sure. But of course, beekeepers have opinions about why different things happen. So one of the things that she talks about is something called washboarding, where you can see bees out and they're sort of doing this on the front board. But we know that they're using fibers when they're doing the capping. And so beekeepers' best guess is some of that washboarding is to collect fibers to use for capping the pupa. So this is an example. As they continue to develop, we have what's called the purple eye stage. You can see they get sort of this purpley brown color. And then as they start to get hairs and change, you'll see that they'll change colors. And then at the end of the 21 days, then they come out. And that is the coolest thing. You'll see bees coming out all the time. Now you see how it's kind of that nice fuzzy brown and flat. That's worker bee, okay? And this is kind of what we call brood. So the worker bee brood is kind of flat, but the drone brood down in the bottom looks more popcorn. They're bigger, so they need a little bit more space, okay? And then you'll see other kinds of things. But the 3 stages, the egg, the larva, and the pupal stage, are what we refer to as brood. So when I say you need to know how to read a brood frame, that's what I'm talking about. It's going to be all those stages, and you're going to need to know something about all of those. And here's another example of bee development. And this is one of the PDFs that I had John upload into the chat. And it shows basically for every day for the worker, for the drone, and for the queen, what it looks like. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the individual bees. So the drones are the males, and they develop from an unfertilized egg, except they're fertile. And this is one of the things that's really kind of confusing, because drones are unfertilized, but they're fertile. Worker bees are fertilized, but they're unfertile. And so we'll talk about that. But anyway, so they're basically, you know, their genetics are exactly the same as the queen. So they're fertile, which means they have testicles and they have sperm, and their whole development is really, they're really there to be able to go out and mate with other queens. So they develop in the larger cells. Their cells are a little bit bigger. The queen, when she goes around to the different cells, she uses her front legs to measure the size of the cell. And if it's a smaller one, she'll lay an egg and fertilize it, and that'll be a worker bee. If it's a little bit bigger, she'll lay an egg in it and not fertilize it, and it'll become a drone. They have big abdomens. They have really big eyes. So, you know, we talk about the unibrows with them. And they also have 20/20 vision. They don't have a stinger. And they only eat and take mating flights. And so we typically, you know, the queen will start laying drones about now, I guess. This is an unusual year, so I'm not sure what's going on in there. Maybe still a little bit early, but it's a little bit further south. I know that they're laying drones. And then in the fall, the worker bees haul them out and throw them off the front porch and let them starve, because they don't want to be feeding them all winter. They, you know, they really want to keep the honey for the worker bees and the queen. So you only have drones, you know, during sports season, I guess is what we call it. Anyway, and there's not as many, and the workers will control how many you have. So, you know, about 600 per hive, maybe more. You know, and they can live up to 3 or 4 months typically. And they say only 17% of the cells in feral hives are drone size. There's actually more drones in feral hives than there are in our managed hives, and that has to do also with using foundation. So that's drones. The queens, she's female. She's her larva is fed royal jelly only, and she's fertile. She has well-developed ovaries, and she has a spermatheca, where is when she goes out and mates, that's where the sperm is stored. It's a different organ. And when next week we'll be talking more about the insides of the honeybees, so we'll talk about that. She has a stinger, but it's not barbed, so she can sting multiple times. She doesn't have pollen baskets or wax glands, which the worker bees do. So she's female, but she doesn't have those things. She's got a bald thorax, and the thorax shows there's the head, and then the little thing in the middle is called the thorax, and then there's the abdomen. And so she's kind of shiny. So when I was learning to spot queens, Janice would always say, look for the shiny. And that was really helpful, because she is shiny. She moves differently, and she's shiny. She doesn't take as long to develop, so 15 to 17 days. She'll go out or, you know, bees, when they first come out, they do orientation flights where they kind of fly around. You can watch them, they kind of do these spirally things. They're trying to orient so they know where their hive is. So she'll do that, and then she'll go out on mating flights. She'll lay eggs probably about 10 months of the year. There's only one queen per hive, and they used to live 4 or 5 years, but with all the pesticide and everything, now it's 1 to 2 years. And the record for even before we had all the pesticides, I think, was about 8 years. So that's the queen. And this is what she looks like in her cell after they cap the cell. And it's a bigger cell. She's not in the cell the same way that the other bees are. And you can see there's a ton of royal jelly in there, so that there's lots for her to eat. And these are some of the different, so on the left, that's what a queen cell looks like. Queen cells are not in the cell, they kind of popped out and they look sort of like a peanut sitting there. And then, and we'll be talking a little bit more about replacing queens. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But there's also something called a queen cup. And that's how it, this one actually has a larva in it. But some bees like to keep queen cups around just in case. So just because you see something like that on the right doesn't necessarily mean that your queen's going to be replaced or they're going to swarm. It might be that the particular bee that you have likes to keep those around. And I have some of those for sure. So the queen goes out and she mates. So a virgin queen will go out. Usually, well, she'll kind of get herself oriented between days 3 and 5. And then she'll go out for mating flights, and she'll mate with at least 12 drones. And they're now finding that she's actually mating, hopefully with even more than that. And they say mating occurs in the DCA, that's the drone congregation area. So think of it as a sports bar that's at treetop level. So typically queens will go about a little further than where the drones, typically drones will fly like 1.5 miles from their hive. Queens typically go a little bit further than that, so that the chance of her actually mating with a drone from her own hive is a little slimmer. But the drones can tell when the queen is out because of the way she smells, and so they'll go and they'll congregate and try to mate with the queen. And the sperm from when they might mate eventually will migrate into the spermatheca, and then she'll start laying, 2 to 3 days later. Knowing how many days, so the queen, she hatches in 15 or 16 days, then it's a couple days before she's going to go out on her mating flight, and then it's a few days, and if it's raining, she'll delay, and so you got to know about that, and so it's going to be a few more days, and then she'll mate, and it'll be a few days before she lays, and that's all really good to know, because it could be a month between when you see a queen cell appear and when you actually see eggs. And if you panic and get a new queen in there, you'll just be wasting your money. So you have to know about all these numbers in the bee math to be able to maintain your hive. So she'll release 3 to 5 sperm onto each worker egg that she's fertilizing, and no sperm on the drone-sized cells. So why are queens replaced, and why would they decide to replace her? So there's a couple different reasons. If there's something going on where the queen is failing, they can decide to replace her, and those would be called a supersedure cell. And so they'll basically create new queens. When the new queens are ready to hatch, they'll kill the old queen, and typically they do that by surrounding the old queen and vibrating their wings and cooking her to death. That's what balling is. They may do reproductive swarms. So the way that the bees reproduce normally is in the spring, they'll basically create a bunch of new queens. And this is the thing that we're going to start seeing in the next month, probably. The hive will grow very, very fast. There'll be a lot of nectar flow. So it'll be a good time to split the hive to make another one. And so they'll start laying, they'll start making queen cells. And then what'll happen is before the new queens hatch, the old queen and half the bees leave and go set up housekeeping someplace else. And then there's also emergency queen cells. So if something happens to your queen, the bees will try to make a new queen. And you can tell if it's a supersedure, emergency, or a swarm by where they're placed. So if it's up on the frame, they're either a supersedure or an emergency cell. If they're at the very bottom of the frame, they're going to be swarm cells. So that's what we're looking for. Although they sometimes will put swarm cells up above. So don't be surprised if you come across that as well. So that's queen. And then there's a whole thing about, we'll talk more about swarms when we talk about spring, but there's a lot more about reproductive swarm cells, which is basically, they're going to split and create another hive somewhere. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the spring maintenance. Swarms are pretty docile because they've been eating a lot of honey before they take off. A bee can't sting you if they've got a lot of honey in their belly because they can't bend. So they have to regurgitate the honey before they sting you. So they're less likely to sting you. Dry swarms are, they're hungry and so they can be very defensive. There may be virgin queens in with the swarms as well as the mated primary queen. A lot of wax makers in there because they're going to have to set up housekeeping. They're going to have to build homes. And it's really easy. If you can get the queen, the rest of the bees will follow. It's really easy. And we'll talk more about swarms and capturing swarms. But basically swarms are really, as long as they're not up too high in the tree, they're really easy. And the bees are really easy to work with. So that's good to know. And if you see this, you see how the bottom of the cell, those are queen cells. You see how the bottom of the cell is sort of fluted? That means that, that she emerged. Okay, worker bees. They're females, they're larva fed, but they're fed worker jelly. So the first 2.5 days they're fed royal jelly. And then from there, they've got more pollen mixed in with it, so protein. They're infertile. They don't have developed ovaries, and they're inhibited from their ovaries developing by the queen mandibular pheromone, and we'll talk about that with pheromones next time, and also the brood pheromone, and we'll talk about that. They have no spermatheca. If the queen disappears and there's not any of those pheromones anymore, the ovaries can start to develop, and then we'll talk about what happens with that. They have a barbed stinger, so if they sting you and it goes in, it basically pulls their guts out and they'll die. They have pollen baskets and wax glands. We'll talk about those things next time. They live 2 to 5 weeks in the summer, 4 to 8 weeks in the spring and the fall, and about up to 5 months in the winter time. They develop in 21 days. And typically they do 21 days of hive duty, 3 weeks of hive duty, and 3 weeks of foraging. And there's usually, 10 to 60,000. You can have up to 80,000. So those are workers. And then the life cycle of the worker bee is really cool. So there's this example that talks about the whole 63 days from the time the egg is laid until they die. But I really like this one. And this one is available in a black and white version because the yellow is harder to see. But the first thing the worker bee does when they emerge is they clean out their own cell, and then they go around and they do a little bit of housekeeping, and they'll be nurse bees and take care of the other bees. They may do fanning, or if it's cold, they can help raise the temperature in the hive by shivering their wings and stuff, and they can do that. They take care of the nectar. So foraging bees come back with nectar, and they basically regurgitate it into the mouths of the house bees, who then take care of the nectar processing and the honey process. When they get to be about 10 to 12 days old, depending on the time of year and how much nectar flow there is and whatever they happen to need, their wax glands may engage. Then they start, after a little over time, they start to work their way out of the hive. So they can be guard bees, they can be more fanning kind of things, where they might be in the doorway fanning. And when we talk about pheromones, we'll talk about the scent glands that they have, so that bees know which hive to come back to. And then the last couple weeks they'll be out doing the grocery shopping, right? So the bees go out and they get nectar, they get water, they get pollen, and they get propolis, and they bring those things back. When they bring back the pollen, they'll actually go in and kick it off into a cell. But otherwise, they're passing off to the house bees. And the idea being that, they're the last 3 weeks of their life, they're basically flying all the time. I mean, they're in the hive at nights, you know, resting and whatever, but from sun up until sundown, they're out flying and they're wearing out. Their wings are wearing out. They start to, the hair on them starts to wear off. They get a little shabby looking. And hopefully when they die, they'll actually be outside of the hive, because otherwise the nurse bees and the hive bees are going to have to haul their carcasses out of there. So it's really kind of amazing the way the whole life cycle works. And with the bees, they kind of adapt. So if they need more nurse bees, foragers will go back to being nurse bees. If they need foragers, the nurse bees will graduate sooner and become foragers. And they really do what's best for the hive. Nectar and honey, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but they basically bring it back. Nectar is mostly sugar water, and they bring it back in their honey stomach. They deliver it to the house bees, and then the house bees will process it by adding some invertase to help break down the sucrose, and then they'll bubble it. And so during, when we talk about spring management, you need to have enough space in the hive for the bees to have places to put all this nectar that's coming back, because they're going to be fanning it and trying to get it to dry out. And so they've got little droplets all over the place trying to dry it out. And then as it dries out, they pick it up and they put it, and eventually when it gets to be about 18% or lower of water content, then it can be in a cell, and then they'll cap it with honey or with wax. So, and it takes, you know, these are just things that you hear about all the time. It takes 12 worker bees their entire life to make a teaspoon of honey. That doesn't mean that's all they eat, because they're bringing back nectar that's at least 50% water, and some of that they're using for energy and they're eating it. And they make the honey so that they have food for the times when they're not, when they, you know, when there's a nectar dearth or whatever. It's their food. Adults eat mostly honey. Um, every bee needs 1 cell of honey and 1 cell of pollen to make the bee. And to get through winter, in North Carolina, we're now needing 70 to 80 pounds, at least 60 pounds of honey to get them through the winter. Pollen collection, they collect it. Bees are covered with hairs, so when they fly, they're kind of getting static electricity, and so the hairs will pick up the pollen, and then they'll scrape it off and put it in their pollen baskets. So there's a bee covered with pollen, and there it's packed in their pollen baskets. And it's really funny to watch them, because you can tell the new forager bees, because they haven't quite figured out how to balance the pollen baskets, and so they will kind of be, you know, it'll be really pretty funny. And but they figure it out pretty quickly. This is just some different pollen. The spring pollen right now that's coming back, that's a henbit, and it's that red pollen that comes back. And this is Jennifer Saruta, who used to be at Clemson. She's now at University of Tennessee, or Tennessee University. She did, they had all these different flowers with different colored pollens. And so she was able to actually be collecting all these different colors of pollen. So it's kind of cool. And the pollen is stored, it's the protein. Pollen is not used for honey, it's just for protein. It's stored. And if there's not enough pollen, they will actually cannibalize the drone larva and the eggs, and, you know, the other larvae. Propolis is the sticky substance that comes off of, you know, like pine trees and things like that. They collect them in their pollen baskets, and they use it for like self-medicating and for sealing up things. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about pests in the hive. Water collection, they use a ton of water. They need it to dilute the honey to be able to eat the honey. They need it to mix with the bee bread to get it into the cells. They use it for cooling the hive. They use a lot of water. And it would be really nice to think that our bees liked, you know, would go with the really nice clean water, but they don't really, they like smelly water. So that's just what they do. We're going to do some real quick bee biology here because I'm running out of time. And we're going to talk a lot more about this later. And this is another one of the PDFs, but this is the basic parts of the bee. So the head, the thorax, the abdomen, the eyes, the antenna, the jaw, the tongue are all part of the head. They've got five, five eyes. The thorax is where the wings and the legs are attached. Do you see on the front leg, see where it says the antenna cleaner? There's actually a little hooky thing there. So when they get pollen on their antennas, they can actually scrape it off with that. That's really cool. And then the abdomen has all the different sections to it. They have these little holes throughout that are called the spiracles. And that's how it breathes. It actually breathes through its ectoskeleton. Oops, what did I just do? And so quickly, the head, we're going to talk about the head. So the eyes, they've got 5 eyes. They've got 2 compound eyes. This is all the bees. 2 compound eyes, those are the big ones. And then they've got the little simple eyes in the middle. They've got an antenna, they've got mandibles, and they've got the proboscis, which is the tongue. The compound eyes are the ones on the big ones on the outside. The little ones are simple eyes in the middle. The simple eyes, the little ones, are really sort of like light sensing switches. So in the morning, it's dark in the hive, the sun hits the landing board, those light sensors go off and they come out and they fly. At night, as the light is getting dimmer and dimmer, those go off and they stop flying, they start crawling. So if you get in a hive too late at night, they tend to be really noisy and grumpy because they're not flying anymore. And so they tend to be a little more defensive that way. And having bees crawling on you when you're in the hive is not a lot of fun. So there's some more, you can see the difference between the drone's big unibrow on the right and the female bees on the left. The antennas, they use the antennas for all kinds of things. They tap each other with them to get their attention. They use them for smelling. Just really interesting, picking up vibrations and things. And we'll talk about these things more in detail next week. The mouth parts, they use the mandibles for different things, for like picking things up, or if they're chewing bees, they actually are chewing with them. And they, the proboscis is sort of it extracts like a straw, like one of those things that the kids use where you blow it and it unfurls. So they kind of unfurl it to be able to suck things up. And then it kind of collapses back down. So we'll talk more about that in detail. There's some pictures of it. And here's a picture of them gathering nectar. And worker bees feed each other, and they don't really need to. They can feed themselves, but it's more of a community thing where they feed each other. They might go and tap each other with their antenna, and then, the other one will feed them. So that's kind of cool. The thorax, the middle part, the wings are attached. There are four wings, 2 on each side. There's little hooks. So when the wings are out where they're going to fly, they actually have little hooks that hook them together so that they become one big wing instead of 2 little wings. So that's kind of cool. The legs, they've got 6 legs, so 3 on each side. The forward one's got that little hook thing that they use for cleaning off their antenna. The middle legs, they use for helping to pack the pollen baskets and things like that. And the back leg is where they actually have the pollen baskets. The saddlebags are back in there. And the abdomen has all the different parts. I got to get rid of this thing that's on here. I don't know how to do that. That has all the different parts with the organs and the stinger and the wax glands and all those things. We'll be talking a lot about that next time. So there's the abdomen. And then you can see the stinger, how when the barb goes into the skin, it just basically pulls everything out and then the bee will die. And then next time we're really going to be talking about the insides of the bee. and all the different glands and all the different pheromones. And it's really pretty cool when you look at the way the bees were made. And it gets really, I just think it's just amazing. I just really love it. But, and even in this picture, you can see how hairy the bee is, you know, and winter bees tend to be hairier, and you can actually see the hairs on them. So, okay. So do we have questions? Anybody? No questions.
Where are the PDFs?
They're in the chat. Can you see in the chat?
Yeah, there's nothing there.
No?
Except somebody said thank you.
Huh.
Oh. Well,
The question
Yes.
is the only thing the drone does like mate with the queen, or does the drone do some of the tasks the worker bee does?
The drones, the only reason that there are drones are for mating, and not with their queen, but with hopefully other virgin queens. They don't do anything in the hive except eat.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I don't know if it's media everyone.
Yeah, I don't know, Meredith. Is anybody else? Can you see the PDFs in the chat? Anybody else? Yeah,
I
people
have them. I can see 4 of them.
I can.
Okay. Meredith, I'll just send them to you separately. I'm not quite sure why
Okay.
you're not seeing them.
It might have to do with being on a tablet.
Okay.
Oh.
All right. I'll send them to you separately.
Okay.
So next week, we're going to be talking about more of the bee biology and things like, you know, how they see things. How do they know what flowers to go to? And the flowers actually tell them, which is really interesting. And, you know, all the different scents. How do they know they have a queen? How do they know which hive to go back to? You know, there's just a lot of different things, and you know, nutrition and how that affects the health of the bees. So that's next week. So that'll be more, and the scents are really interesting. So, and check out, you know, if you haven't already, did anybody look at the videos of the life cycle that was on my website? Did you like those?
That was cool.
Yes.
Isn't that amazing? National Geographic, man, they just blow me out of the water every time.